Good morning. So today we start the Bible, which will be the final unit before the semester break. Hopefully this will be the most interesting section we do. It's certainly the most important because the Bible is the most important book ever. And it is driving a lot, it has driven a lot of history, it's driving a lot of history today. So if you want to fully understand the conflict in the Middle East, what's happening between Israel and Iran, what's happening in Palestine, you cannot do so without a full understanding of the Bible. At the same time, the Bible is, because it's so important, the ideas around it are very controversial. There are billions of people around the world who believe the Bible is the Word of God. It's Holy Scripture. Every word in the Bible comes to us from the divine, the divinity himself. And obviously, that's not what I believe. More so, I'm going to make arguments in this class that go against not only the traditional understanding of the Bible, but also the mainstream academic understanding of the Bible. So, to be fair to you, I want you to be very skeptical of what I say. Okay? Come to class with doubting my authority, doubting my understanding of the Bible. Okay? So feel free to challenge me, and I want you to challenge me because what I will say in this class will be extremely controversial. Okay? So, let me give you a brief introduction to the Bible, and then I'll explain some of the history behind the Bible, okay? And this overview is going to be very broad, very general, but it will help structure our understanding of the Bible for the next few classes, okay? All right, so the Bible. The Bible is Greek for books, and it really means library. So the first thing you need to understand is the Bible, it's a collection of different works by many different authors. So there's no worldview or consistency or continuity in the Bible. You can find whatever you want in the Bible because it's a library. It's a huge collection of ideas. There's about 2,000 pages. Okay? So there's very few people who actually read the Bible in its entirety. There are people who might read certain sections of the Bible, okay, but most people will receive their understanding of the Bible from authorities like priests or rabbis, okay? The Bible itself is divided into two major sections. The first section is what we call the Hebrew Bible. And so this was originally written in Hebrew, and this is the book of the Jews, okay? What do the Jews believe? They believe in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible itself is divided into three major sections. The first is, so the Hebrew term for the Bible is the Tanakh, okay? So you may hear some people say the Tanakh. It just means the Hebrew Bible, okay? The Tanakh is T and K. And this is the Hebrew term for certain ideas. The T stands for Torah or teachings. So this is the laws of the Jewish tradition. Okay, for example, the Ten Commandments, right? Second is N, which means prophets. And the prophets themselves are divided into minor and major. So in Rome, the people who are most admired are the generals, right? Julius Caesar, Pompey. In Greece, the people who are most admired are the poets, Homer and the playwrights. In the Jewish tradition, the people who are most admired are the prophets. These individuals who speak the truth of God. They're social critics, and they're people who challenge the authority of the kings in order to promote the laws and teachings of God. Okay? Does that make sense? The prophets are the people who are most admired in the Jewish tradition. And the third are okay, is writings. So basically, things that don't really belong in teachings and prophets, but which have some cultural or religious significance to the Jewish people. Okay? So this is the Hebrew Bible. And then we get to the New Testament, which is something that only Christians believe. All right? So Jewish people do not accept anything in the New Testament. The New Testament calls the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament. Okay? Why? Because the Old Testament is the promise of salvation. Okay? The promise of Jesus Christ. The New Testament is the deliverance or the fulfillment of this promise in Jesus Christ. Okay? It's a coming and the work of Jesus Christ. The New Testament itself is divided into many different works. It's a lot smaller than the Old Testament. So there are the Gospels. The Gospels is Greek for the good word. And the good news is that Jesus is on earth. And he's here to deliver us from our sins and our suffering. There's letters, mainly by someone named Paul. And these are the work of Jesus' apostles after the death of Jesus. They go around the world and they promote the gospel of Jesus, the good news. Okay? And this is about what they do. And then there's some other books as well, but the major one is called Revelation, which is about the end of the world. And it's the idea of the second coming. How even though Jesus is dead, he will return and he will bring peace, eternal peace, to the world. Now, from the Bible, in interpretation of the Bible comes the Quran. And this is the basis for Islam. Okay? So eventually we'll do all three. The Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran. But we'll start with the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Okay? So the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is what we'll start with. And to do so, I will have to teach you a lot of history. And this history will be extremely broad. Okay? But over time, I will be more precise. I will go into specific details about this history in order for you to better understand the Bible. Okay? There are three ideas about the Hebrew Bible that Jews believe, the Jews today believe, which are not true. Okay? The first idea is the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish religion, has always been monotheistic. Meaning, the Jews have always believed in one God. His name is Yahweh. And he is the God of the Jews since Abraham, who is the patriarch of all Jewish people. Okay? That's what Jews believe. I will show you this is not true. In the beginning, Jewish people, like everyone else, were polytheistic. Okay? Monotheistic is a modern idea that has been retroactively put back into Jewish history. Okay? So that's the first myth that I will correct. The second myth that I correct is that Jewish history or the Jewish religion has been continuous for at least 3,000 years, possibly 4,000 years. Okay? And what I will show you is that's not true. So there have been many major changes to the religion, and these changes are so drastic that you can argue these are very different people, okay? So the Israelites, the people who founded the religion, are very different from the people we call Jews today. And I will show you why in the next few classes, okay? That's one really important idea you need to understand. The history of the Israelites and the Jewish people are not continuous. All right? Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, any questions so far? Are you guys following along? Okay. Yeah, so and the last idea is the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, it's a historical record. And what I will show you is we've been trying for at least 300 years, 200 years to prove that the Bible is a historical record. Okay? There are archaeologists who've spent fortunes their entire lifetimes looking for things like Noah's Ark, looking for people like Moses. Can't find them, okay? And this tells us pretty conclusively that the Bible is not a historical record. It is a work of our imagination. Okay? It is a literary work. Now, it's a very powerful literary work, and that's what explains its relevance and its power today. Okay? I'll explain why it's powerful, but I want you to remember, it's not a historical work. It is a literary work. It's a work of our collective imagination. All right? Okay. Now, I'm going to talk a little about the broad history of the Israelite people. Okay? So, in the Bible, what it tells you is, maybe about 2000 BCE, there's a man named Abraham. And he's from the city of Uruk, okay? In Mesopotamia. Or is it Ur? Okay, it's one of the two, sorry. And then God, Yahweh, thought Abraham was the best man in the world. So God, Yahweh, made a covenant with Abraham and said, you are the most righteous and dignified man I've ever seen in the world, and I will make you a father of a new nation called Israel. Okay? And these people will become eventually the Israelites. And the greatest king of the Israelites is named David. And then God says to David, David, you are the greatest man I've ever seen. I love you as you love me. Therefore, I will make your house, the house of David, eternal. Okay? You, the house of David, will reign over Israel for all of eternity. I will make Israel into the mightiest of nations. Okay? So that is what it says in the Bible. The historical record is a lot more complicated. All right? So let's start in the year 1200 BCE. And this is towards the end of the Bronze Age, right? We're about to enter the Bronze Age collapse, which lasts about for 100 years. At this time, let's look at the world. Israel is in a place called the Levant. And the Levant has always been important because, as we discussed in previous classes, Levant was one of the first centers of agriculture. So Jericho is in the Levant. But it's also important because the Levant is where three major civilizations and empires meet, okay? They are the crossroads or the nexus of empire. These three empires are Egypt, which, again, for most of its human history has been the wealthiest and the most powerful nation. Okay? Over here is Mesopotamia, which is the creative civilization. This is where human civilization first developed mathematics, writing, astronomy, architecture. Okay? And up here are the Hittites, or Anatolia. And Anatolia, again, is extremely wealthy. So the Levant is sort of sandwiched between three extremely aggressive, wealthy, and powerful nations that are extremely advanced and sophisticated. So the Levant has always been a colony of either Egypt or Anatolia. Okay? It's not been very independent for very long, and it can't be because it's at the edge of empire. But because of its position, okay, the Levant is what we call a melting pot. or a meeting place. So every culture, every language, every religion that was imaginable at this time met in the Levant. Okay? Mainly for trade purposes, right? Because, again, Egypt and Mesopotamia are extremely wealthy. For the Levant, you can go across the Mediterranean into all of Europe and into northern Africa. Okay? So the Levant was really the center of the world for most of its history. And so it was a meeting place mainly for traders. Right? At this time, Levant was divided into different sections. A province called Canaan was a province of Egypt. And Canaan was special to Egypt because the Egyptians loved two things. They loved wine, they loved olive oil. And the Levant was very good at harvesting both wine, good wine, and olive oil. So, but the Egyptians didn't really like to go outside Egypt. So the people administrating the Levant were local elites tied to Egypt, but also foreign mercenaries. And these foreign mercenaries were from as far as Greece. Okay? And we know this because we've discovered Greek pottery that dates back to this period. These foreign mercenaries would then intermarry with a local woman because, as you can imagine, these are young males. Okay? You also had lots of nomads living in the Levant because of Arabia, right? Okay? Lots of nomads, people we call the Bedouins. You also had people living in the hills of the Levant, the hill people. Then you have these cities, okay? The Canaanites. You also had, believe it or not, Egyptian priests living in this area. Why would they live in this area? Well, because they had a certain religion that was considered heretical or controversial in Egypt, so they had to leave to practice their religion. Or maybe they were priests who got into a political struggle, and as such, they were exiled to the Levant. Okay? So, does that make sense? The Levant, it's not at this point a nation. At this point, it's really a meeting place, a melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions. It's as diverse as can be. And historically, this has always been the case. Right? Then what happened, of course, is the Bronze Age collapse. The thing about the Bronze Age collapse is you have this massive migration of people looking for food. Right? These are called the sea peoples. They're basically like pirates. And there are these massive waves of sea people attacking the Hittites, attacking the Levant, and attacking Egypt. And again, these are like refugees. Okay? This is a forced migration, and they're trying to feed their families. They basically overrun the Hittites. They destroy the cities of the Levant. And they almost destroy Egypt, but Egypt, because it's so wealthy, it's able to hold off the sea people. Eventually what happens is the sea peoples and Egypt come to an agreement and say, listen, stop attacking us and we'll give you land in the Levant. You can settle down there. You can grow your own food. You can feed your families. Okay? And this place is what we call Philistia. And these people are called the Philistines. So these are basically the sea peoples. Mainly Greek, actually. There are a lot of Greeks among the Philistines. But this creates a problem for everyone in the Levant, because now you have a foreign presence that is very aggressive and expansionist. Okay? So now the people in the Levant need to come together and fend off this threat from the Philistines. They also have these neighbors as well, these other cultures that keep on attacking them. Okay? So these are extremely diverse people, and So what they agree to do is elect a king to lead them in war against the Philistines. And this person is named Saul, King Saul. All right? And King Saul is a very good king. He's a very good military leader. He's helping the people in the Levant fend off the Philistines and aggressive neighbors. Okay, so this is a military alliance. King Saul employs a lot of mercenaries. And one of these mercenaries is named David. David is an extremely capable, charismatic soldier who develops a following. David, as you can imagine, because he's very charismatic, is also very ambitious. And eventually, he has a falling out with Saul, okay? David is Saul's best general, best soldier, but David is too ambitious. And Saul sort of suspects David. So what David does is he runs off and joins the Philistines. Okay? He's not fighting for the Philistines. What's really important for us to understand, and I know it's a hard concept, okay? But borders and alliances and allegiances are extremely fluid at this time. If it benefits me, I'll fight for you. But if it doesn't benefit me, then I'll betray you, okay? There are different factions within all alliances. Okay, so the Philistines are divided among different ethnic groups. The people in the Levant are divided into different political factions. You have these hill people, you have these nomads, you have these foreign mercenaries, and they're fighting for different reasons. So these alliances are always shifting, okay? So David goes off and fights for the Philistines. King Saul and his sons are eventually killed in battle. And David sees a political opening. So he turns back into Levant, and he starts to politically maneuver to be the new king. Okay? And his power base is in a place called Hebron, or in south the Levant. But the house of Saul is still around. And so there's a civil war now going on. And eventually David triumphs. And then David's able to unite these people, and he creates a new nation called Israel. All right? And then Israel is able, under David's leadership, is able to basically put down any aggressions from its neighbors. And they're able to build an empire, a small empire, okay? Nowhere near Egypt, but it's an empire. All right? So this is what we know from the archaeological record. But David is so charismatic that when he dies, his son Solomon is not able to hold the empire together. So what happens is Israel divides into the northern kingdom and Judah, which is where the house of David is. Okay. Now again, the Levant is a very important strategic location. So as these empires, major empires, start to consolidate the power, they want to take over the Levant. Okay? So the Assyrian Empire comes in and destroys the northern kingdom. And then eventually, the Babylonian Empire will come in and destroy Judah. Okay? The Babylonians will take the Israel elite, basically the royalty, and force them to go to Babylon, where they will be held as hostages or captives. Eventually, what will happen next is the Persian Empire will come and defeat Babylon. And what they do next is very interesting. They decide they will release these Israelite elite, have them return to Jerusalem and Israel, and have them govern the Levant based on, and have them govern the Levant. Okay, does that make sense? And it is only at this point that we get the term Jews. Okay, this is a Persian idea, the Jews, before they're called the Israelites. And this is about 500 BC, okay? 500 BC. And now we have a radical departure from the tradition, okay? And so I'll explain three major differences. And then I'll go into detail about these differences in future classes, okay? The first major difference is Israel, under Israelites, it's a polytheistic religion. They have one God, Yahweh, but they also have a pantheon of gods, which is true for every other religion, right? There's a pantheon of gods. Yahweh is at the top, but they also celebrate other gods like Baal and Asherah, okay? We know because they're written down in the Bible. So we know at this point, Israel is still a polytheistic religion. But after the Persian Empire returns them to Jerusalem, they became a monotheistic religion, or the beginnings of a monotheistic religion. Why? Because when the Jews are released from captivity by the Persians, their religion merges with that of the Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism is a dualistic religion, okay? Meaning there's good and evil. So that's the first major difference. At the beginning, the Bible was very much a polytheistic religion, and then after the Israelites became the Jews, it became monotheistic, okay? Second big difference is this. Second big difference is, during this time, the people with the power in Israel were the kings, okay, the monarchy. But after 500 BCE, the Jews decided they didn't want any kings. And they couldn't have kings because their overlords are the Persians, right? So the center of power became the priesthood. Okay? The priests. The people with the absolute authority are the priests, not the kings. There are kings, but the kings are not subservient to the priests who speak on behalf of Yahweh. Okay? Because now it's a monotheistic religion. And then there's one other difference. The other difference is, remember, at this point they're polytheistic and they're kings, okay? Which means they are tolerant. They're welcoming of other religions, right? Because you're polytheistic. But also, as kings, you need to establish diplomatic alliances with other countries who have different religions, right? So when you marry someone from another political dynasty, you also are marrying into that religion. Does that make sense? So Israel, under the kings, is a very tolerant religion. But if you're run by priests, right, you become intolerant because you insist that your religion is the best. Okay? And that's why after the Persians lost control and the Greeks came in to the Levant, this is the Seleucid Empire, okay? The Jews rebelled against the Greeks because the Greeks were polytheistic and the Jews considered themselves monotheistic, okay? They refused to acknowledge the culture and the religion of the Greeks. And then things got really bad when the Romans came in, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, so this is the history of the Jewish people up until the birth of Jesus, okay? Any questions so far? Do you guys understand what's happening?
How did the Bronze Age collapse?
Excuse me?
How did the Bronze Age collapse?
Okay, so how did the Bronze Age collapse? Okay, we talked about this, okay? We don't know why it collapsed. The mainstream academic understanding is it was a perfect storm of several factors, including climate change, including civil unrest, including natural disasters like earthquakes, okay, including competition among empires. What's important to understand is when we talk about the Bronze Age collapse, we're really talking about basically this area. If you go east to Mesopotamia, where the Assyrian and the Babylonians are, they're fine. Okay? And it's the Bronze Age collapse that allow the Assyrians and the Babylonians to eventually become world powers. So the Bronze Age collapse was not a global phenomenon. It was a localized phenomenon to the Mediterranean. Okay? But why the Bronze Age collapse is important is because the Bronze Age collapse will give us Greek civilization, Homer and Plato, okay? It will also give us the Bible, right? Because if you look at this history, Israel would not have come into being without the Bronze Age collapse. Egypt or the Hittites would continue to control the Levant, right? And it's important to understand the Greeks and the Bible are the basis, the two fundamental pillars of Western civilization. You understand? That's why Westerners are so fascinated by the Bronze Age collapse. Because in their minds, the Bronze Age collapse is part of God's divine plan or design to create classical Greece and the nation of Israel so that his vision for the world can be achieved through Jesus. Okay? Yep. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question. So the argument I'm trying to make to you is the Bible says Abraham is a patriarch of the Israelites. But the historical record, the archaeological record is we barely have evidence of David. We have absolutely no evidence of anything before David. Okay? So I think David is the founder of the nation of Israel, not Abraham. Next class, I'll explain to you why they constructed this mythology, okay? All right? But first, I want to give you a broad overview. All right? Next class, I will explain to you where these ideas, Abraham and Moses, came from. It'll make sense when I explain it to you. Okay? But do you guys have any more questions before I go on? Yep.
Can you clarify on how the Israel religion merges with Zoroastrianism that made them?
Okay. Right. Okay. So, what happened during the Persian period, right? Okay. So at this point, the religion of Israel is no different from the local areas. It's a polytheistic religion with a pantheon of gods, okay? And maybe Yahweh's at the top, or maybe Yahweh's co-equal, okay? We don't know. And at this point, there are many divergent religions, okay? But what happens is Babylon conquers Jerusalem, and then the Jews are sent in exile. So now the religion is sent overseas. And the religion is detached from the culture and the people. Does that make sense? And what we know is when you do that, when you detach the religion and you put it into a place that has no interactions with the local people and the culture, it becomes much more fanatical. It becomes much more focused and fanatical. Okay, do you understand? Okay? Do you understand? Because if it's in Israel and there are different cultures, the religion has to be tolerant and police different factions among the people. Okay? Does that make sense? But once this religion goes off to Babylon, it's now divorced from the people, from local reality. So the elite can design in a way that they think is most appropriate. And we call that fanatical. Does that make sense? So an example of this, okay, it's a bad analogy, but maybe this will help you. Right now, you're not sure what it means to be Chinese. Okay? You're Chinese, but Chinese in China is a very fluid, very diverse identity. When you go out to America, right, then you have much more concrete, much more clear understanding of what it means to be Chinese. Your Chinese identity becomes much more formed. Does that make sense? Okay? And the same thing with religion. Within Israel itself, the religion is constantly changing. It's very fluid. But when they're off to Babylon, they have to use the religion to survive as a people, as an identity. And so it becomes much more formed, okay? Much more concrete. Does that make sense? And then what happens is, now that it's much more concrete, it now interacts with Zoroastrianism, which is the religion of the Persians. And at this point, the religion becomes basically what it is today. Okay? So I'm sorry, I don't think I've explained this clearly to you, but I want to wait until we get to this period, okay? Right now I'm just giving you a broad overview. Okay? Any more questions before I begin? Before I continue? All right. Now I want to talk about the Bible, okay? Because the Bible is the mythology. It's a collective memory of the Israelites, okay? And so I'm going to discuss why the Bible was first created in this class. And what I will explain to you is the Bible was first created in order to explain and justify and create legitimacy for David. Okay? This is what we call an apology. And this is a very common practice. The idea is this. Most kings, every king, obtains power through really nefarious means. Okay? They either kill a lot of people to obtain power, or maybe the younger brother kills the older brother to usurp the throne. Okay? Usually, kingship requires ruthlessness. But the problem is, when you're ruthless, you have a legitimacy problem. Right? So the way that most kings resolve this issue is by sponsoring writings or an apology to explain why he or she is king. And the answer usually is because God willed it so. Because I had no choice in the matter. I'm not ambitious. I was not at all ambitious. But the circumstances forced my hand. To save my people, to do God's work, I had to kill my brother. I had to kill my enemies. Even though I myself am not a violent person. Okay? That's usually how the apology goes. Okay? So remember, back at this point, the very idea of writing, it is new. It's a new technology, but it's also a very expensive technology, meaning you need to buy the materials, okay, which are rare, but you also need the people to be able to write, okay, and they're also very expensive. And you basically need it to be able to support a team of scribes to create any work of fiction. So writing back then is like movie making today. Okay, it's a very expensive endeavor that was usually sponsored by the king in order to justify or explain why he is king, in order to create legitimacy. Okay? Does that make sense? So the Bible was created first as an apology for David and explains why the house of David is now in charge of Israel. But as we discussed, okay, eventually the house of David, Israel, divides into two nations. Now the house of David, the Bible, goes with the house Judah, okay, to Judah. But the northern kingdom now needs its own mythology, its own Bible, right? And so a second Bible was created. The people who are in charge of the Bible, the priest class, are interested in promoting their own interests, mainly in the points of ritual. It doesn't make sense? Like, what are rituals? Why do we need them? Why are priests important? Then you have people at this point in the Babylonian captivity looking back at the history of Israel and trying to figure out why the house of David collapsed. And their answer is because the Israelites refused to follow the will of God. Because the Israelites became polytheistic or they became immoral, okay? Does that make sense? In other words, the Bible at this point are divided into like 4 major factions or schools, okay? The school that supports the house of David, the legitimacy of the house of David, is called the J school, okay? The J school. Don't worry about this. I'll explain to you next class what these things mean. The people who support the northern kingdom as legitimate house of Israel is called the E school. E. The school that supports the power of the priests are obviously called the P school, okay, for priests. And then the school that tries to go back in history and examine why Israel fell, and which believe it's because the Israelites betrayed God. These people are what we call the D school, okay? The D school. So E, G, P, and D. And these are just 4 of the major schools. There are other schools as well. All right? And so at this point, the Bible is divided into like 4 major schools or documents controlled by different factions. When the Persians take over, okay, they insisted, you need one religion, guys. You need one document. And so all 4 were put together to create the Bible. But the way they did it was very interesting. All they did was just put them together, okay? You understand? So if you read the Bible, it's like A, B, C, D. A, B, C, D. Okay? So one line is from the E school, the next line is from the J school, the other line is from the P school. It's very confusing to read. If you don't understand this history, it is impossible for you to read the Bible. I'm not sure if you've tried to read the Bible, it's not readable. Okay? So why would they do this? Why would they just put all 4 texts together without major editing or revisions? Why? Do you guys know? Why would they do that? They just made a complete mess of the Bible. But why would they do that? Okay, so let me explain. The first major reason is most people didn't read or write back then. So the Bible itself didn't really matter. What mattered was the oral explanation of the Bible controlled by the priest class. Does that make sense? The people didn't read the Bible. So how the Bible was actually written was not that important. It was important for the priests to have access to the Bible, okay, but the people didn't actually read the Bible. That's the first reason. The second, more important reason is because the Bible is political real estate. And I want you to remember this idea, okay? It's the most valuable political real estate in the world. Everyone wants to be in the Bible because to be in the Bible gives you legitimacy. It gives you power, right? So, if you're a king, you have 4 sons who all want to be king, well, your best solution is to divide the kingdom among the 4 sons, right? Same with the Bible. You have 4 extremely powerful schools and political factions. So the best way to resolve the issue is just to say, listen, we'll put you all in the Bible together, okay? And when you merge them, it's a lot easier than if you just try to do it by order, okay? Like E school goes first, and J school, then P school, then D school, okay? They just put them all together. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is a very important idea. The Bible is the most valuable political real estate in the world. Everyone wants to be in there. And what ideas you can find in there will ultimately shape human history. Okay? Any questions so far before I continue? All right. So the last thing I want to talk about today is the apology of David, which is the beginning of the Bible. Okay. So when kings come to power, they have three major problems, right? The first major problem is legitimacy. What gives you the right to be king? Okay. Second problem is the idea of identity. And this is a huge problem for the Israelites because the Israelites is a multicultural entity. You have people speaking different languages, different cultures. They practice different cultures, they practice different religions. So now you need to create an identity that everyone accepts. Okay? The third thing is differentiation. You need not only for these people to get along, but you need to get them to divorce their former culture. Does that make sense? Because you have Egyptian priests in there. And you have to tell these Egyptian priests, you're now Israelites and you're not Egyptian anymore. And the example that we use for this is Augustus Caesar and the writing of the Aeneid. Okay? Remember, the Aeneid, it's a book about a character named Aeneas. And it provides political legitimacy to Augustus Caesar because Augustus Caesar is a direct descendant of Aeneas, who is the founder of Rome. Also, what the Aeneid said is Augustus Caesar is the end point of Roman history. Everything before Augustus Caesar led to him. Augustus Caesar is like the Jesus of Rome. Okay? He is the salvation, he is the redemption of Rome. Okay, that's what the Aeneid does. Okay? Second thing about the Aeneid is it creates a new Roman identity that focuses on piety, loyalty over liberty. Remember the problem for Augustus Caesar was Romans didn't like kings. Well, now he's a king. So how do you get people to obey? Well, you tell them piety is more important than liberty. All right? The third idea is the Aeneid, remember, it's anti-Greek. The problem for Rome at that time was Greek culture was vastly superior to Roman culture. And so a lot of Romans were adopting Greek cultural practice like Mark Antony. And so the Aeneid said, Greek culture is like the Trojan horse. If you let into your city, Greek culture will corrupt you and destroy you. Okay? So, guess what, guys? Every king has to resolve all three issues, okay? Legitimacy, identity, and differentiation. And that's what David is trying to do with the Bible. Okay, so I'll give you three examples, three stories from the Bible that illustrate David's quest for legitimacy. Next class, we will talk about identity and differentiation and how the Bible achieves that, okay? But for this class, I want to focus on legitimacy. So, now that David is king, a lot of people don't think he's legitimate. Why? Because he ruthlessly tried to usurp the throne from Saul, right? Saul is the king that everyone picked or elected. And he was a good king. He was good at war. He was someone that most people liked. And David stole the throne from him, okay? So now, what is David's problem now that he has a throne? Others will try to steal it from him, right? You understand? Because if you, David, if you set the precedent, if you steal the throne, then others are now empowered to steal the throne from you as well. Okay? So the first thing the Bible does, the apology for David does, is show us David loved Saul. He was not at all ambitious. He cared only for the well-being of his king. Okay? And so one story that illustrates this, there are actually many, many stories in the Bible that does this, but one story that illustrates this is this. So Saul thinks David's trying to kill him. So he's chasing after David with his army, okay, trying to kill David and his followers. One day, Saul is alone in a cave, praying to God for deliverance. David sees Saul alone, and he sneaks up behind Saul. Then he takes his sword and cuts a piece of Saul's clothing. Okay? And then David disappears. Saul leaves the cave, and then David rushes to him and says, Saul, my king, I beg of you, give me a second. Let me explain to you. Back then in the cave, I could have killed you. This is a piece of clothing to prove I could have killed you. But I didn't, because I love you, because I'm loyal to you. I would never kill you. And then Saul says, oh, this is proof that you never meant to kill me. Okay? And this is a story in the Bible. Obviously, this story cannot be true, okay? But this is what the Bible is trying to do. It's trying to first show us that David is not all ambitious. In fact, the entire apology of David is focused on the lack of ambition of David. Okay? So that's the first story. Let's look at the second story. Okay? The second story is this. Saul is dead, and his son, who's a young man, comes into the throne. There's a general named Abner, okay? Abner, who was loyal to Saul, but now that Saul is dead and David is very popular among the people, Abner sees the political winds changing, and Abner tries to align himself with David. So Abner writes a long letter to David and saying, listen, I will swear loyalty to you, and will end the civil war between the house of Saul and the house of David. You will unite Israel. And then David writes back and says, yeah, come to me. I'll give you a feast, and then we'll be friends. And so Abner comes, David gives him a feast. And then as Abner leaves, he runs into David's general named Joab. And Joab and Abner go a long way back, okay? They were friends, they were enemies. Abner killed Joab's brother. And in an act of anger, Joab stabs Abner to death, okay, and Abner is dead. And once Abner is dead, the house of Saul basically gives up, and David is able to unite Israel. Okay, now that's the story in the Bible. David is so angry by this that he curses Joab, and he gives Abner a great funeral. Right? Because David does not want to betray his friends. Why is this story wrong or completely made up? It's not made up, but it's what we call spin, right? Clearly, Abner and David had a feast together, and clearly Joab killed Abner. But why is the Bible version of this event wrong or incorrect? It can't be true. You guys know? Okay, this is hard, okay? But the reason is this. If you're David and you're king, which person in the world are you most afraid of? If you're the king, there's a person in this world you're most afraid of, or you're most suspicious of. Who is that person? Abner. Okay, yeah, he is suspicious of Abner. But in general, you should be suspicious of Joab, right? Because Joab has access to your army. Abner is your enemy, but Joab has access to your army. So if Joab wants to betray you, he could. Okay? So in other words, because David is most suspicious of Joab, if Joab were ever to act independently, then David would need to kill him. Does that make sense? And in this circumstance, Joab acted independently. David told Joab Abner was an honored guest. And Joab didn't care. He was angry about the death of his brother, and he kills Abner. This cannot possibly be true. You understand? Joab had to kill Abner because he was ordered to by David. Right? Now why would David want Abner to be killed? Because in his mind he thinks, oh, if Abner can betray the house of Saul, he can also betray the house of David. He is an ambitious man. And why would he think like that? Why would David come to this conclusion? Because he himself is like that. Do you understand? He himself betrayed Saul. So he's very, very careful or cautious about people who betray their leaders. Right? Abner betrayed the house of Saul, and it was very likely that he would betray David at some point as well. And so David had to have him killed. Right? But he could not say this publicly. Because if you were to say this publicly, then it would show he, in fact, knew this because he betrayed Saul. Does that make sense? The logic of this? Okay? But you can see how wonderful the spin is. It's almost impossible to see the truth from this, right? If you're a person, you know, okay, David, you know that Joab killed Abner, and you were told the story, you would believe the story. It's just because Abner was angry that he killed, it was just because Joab was angry, he killed Abner. Okay, you believe that, right? But you think about it, it can't be true, okay? Now, I'm going to give you one more story. And this story is actually even harder to figure out because of the spin. Okay? Now that David is king of Israel, Israel has many enemies. So his armies are always at war. Okay? One day, David is on the rooftop of his house. So, and Israel's not a very rich place, okay? So these are not palaces, they're just houses, okay? And so David is strolling on his rooftop, and across from him is a woman named Bathsheba. And she's bathing naked. And David is overcome with lust. He's like, I must have this woman, okay? And he's king. He orders his servant to go get her. She comes. They have sex. Okay? The problem is, we have sex, but she gets pregnant. Okay? The problem now is, Bathsheba's married to a man named Uriah, the Hittite. And Uriah the Hittite is one of David's best soldiers, and he's fighting for David and Israel somewhere else. So David's like, oh, this is a problem because once Uriah comes home and he finds Bathsheba has a new child, he's going to know it's not his. So either he's going to kill her or he's going to figure out it's David to come kill him. Okay? So David, being very clever, has a solution to this. He invites Uriah back home. Okay? So Uriah comes home from the war, and Uriah thinks, oh, the king has called for me. Therefore, it's an emergency. Okay, so he rushes back, and David meets Uriah at his house, and David says, listen, Uriah, you've been doing such a great job. You're such a great soldier. You're so loyal. I want to give you a vacation. Go home and be with your wife. And Uriah's like, my king, my comrades are dying. They're starving out in the battlefield. I cannot abandon them. How can I find pleasure in my wife when my friends are suffering? I refuse to go home. I will not go home until the battle is won. And David tries his best, but he can't convince Uriah to go home. So then David tells Uriah, you're such a great soldier, you're so loyal, I'm so happy and proud that you fight for me. And he gives Uriah a letter to his general, Joab, okay? And the letter instructs Joab to kill Uriah. Joab will send Uriah with his soldiers out in the battlefield. And then at the last minute, Joab will recall his soldiers, leaving Joab by himself. At this point, the enemies will swarm Uriah and kill Uriah. Okay? And that's what happens. And once Uriah is dead, David marries Bathsheba. And they're about to have a child together. At this point, David is visited by a prophet named Nathan. And Nathan says to David, I want to ask you a question. And David says, sure, go ahead. Nathan says, let's imagine there are two shepherds. There's a rich shepherd with 100 sheep, and there's a poor shepherd with 2 sheep. There's a traveler, a foreign guest, who comes into town, and the rich shepherd wants to honor him with a feast. The rich shepherd steals the poor man's shepherd to feed the traveler. Who's in the wrong? And David says, of course the rich shepherd is in the wrong. He's indignant. He's angry. How could a man be so unrighteous as to steal another man's sheep? And then Nathan says, you, David, are the rich shepherd. You have violated God's law. You are in the wrong. And as punishment, God will take away your son or your child with Bathsheba. And that's what happens. And David goes into mourning, okay? He is distraught, he's depressed. And he writes a lot of poetry. Okay, so this is a very powerful story. And this is a story that has captured the imagination of everyone for 1,000 years. But it's complete spin. This is not what happened, okay? How do we know? Okay, first thing is this. Nathan says to David, you have stolen a man's you have stolen a man's wife. Therefore, you're in the wrong. What's the problem with this logic? What is David's crime? Real crime. Guys, he killed Uriah. Right? You understand? You've forgotten this fact. He had Uriah killed. That's the real crime. He killed Uriah. Yeah, he slept with Bathsheba. That's bad. But it's much worse if you murder someone, okay? So another question then is, why would he murder Uriah? Why not just talk to him honestly and says, Uriah, I'm sorry, I love your wife. I had sex with her. I'm sorry. Why did David have to get Uriah killed? Why was Uriah killed? Yeah, because the army is loyal to Uriah, right? So why would David fear Uriah? Because Uriah is a popular, brave soldier, just like David. And David used his popularity in order to usurp the throne from Saul, right? Therefore, David thinks Uriah could do the same thing to me. Therefore, I have to get him killed. In other words, this Bathsheba thing must have come later to disguise the fact that David killed Uriah because he feared Uriah's popularity. Does that make sense? Right? You see how clever this story is? The historical truth must have been David feared Uriah's popularity. And he needed to get rid of Uriah. So he concocted this plan. And then, after he killed Uriah, he needed to explain to his army, okay, who loved Uriah, why this happened. And then they was like, oh, because I fell in love with his wife. I couldn't control myself. I'm just a man. Okay? God is God. I'm a man. I'm a king. I can't be God. I can't control my emotions. Right? Does that make sense? But the irony of this is because David is working so hard to disguise his ruthlessness, he's creating very powerful literature. He created a very powerful story that has captured the imagination of readers for a long time. If you think about it, if you think a lot about the story, it unleashes a lot of ideas in you. Okay? You have to ask yourself, what is man? What is God? Are we capable of controlling our emotions? So in other words, this story is extremely well constructed that inspires you to imagine your own personal and emotional and moral life. We call this literature, right? So, guys, it's no coincidence that today the Jewish people are the most creative people in the world. When you go to America for university, most of your professors are Jewish. Most of the best thinkers in the world are Jewish. These past 200 years, there have been 3 revolutionary thinkers. Karl Marx, Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud. They're all Jewish, who have been raised in the Jewish tradition of asking deep questions about what it means to be human. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions about this?
So why would people during that time believe like the apology of David?
Okay, that's a great question, okay? So the question is, why would people believe this apology of David? And, well, the answer is most didn't believe the apology of David, okay? Most were very clear about David's ambitions. But when you're king, you need to impose your reality on others, okay? So this is why this is written. And so it was written for people who were part of David's political coalition. Do you understand? His enemies wouldn't believe this, right? But it was basically meant to appease or convince those who want to believe David. Does that make sense? Okay, spin. And it happens today, guys. When you watch the news, it's spin. Right? It's distorting reality. And so most people will believe the media, right? There are some people who will never believe the media. Like, I don't believe anything the media tells me, whether it's Chinese media or American media. I know a lot of history to understand the media is distorting reality. Okay? But most people will believe this because they have absolutely no interest in not believing it. Right? David's king. If you don't believe it, then you have to believe your king is a murderer. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah, Echo?
What's the mainstream understanding of this story?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Okay, this is really important. What's the mainstream understanding of the story? So the mainstream understanding of the story is it has to be true. Why? Because it puts David in a bad light. Do you understand? And it shows the genius of David because David is wrestling with his own morality. David is being honest. Right? So the mainstream understanding is David is a poet king. He's a man who prays constantly and engages in a process of self-reflection. And that's what makes David great. Okay? He's constantly praying to God. In fact, the Bible just goes on endlessly about this, how David is constantly in communication with God. And in this communication, he's praying and asking for light, for truth in his own weaknesses, okay? To be delivered from his failings as a man. And the Bathsheba story is emblematic about this, because why would a man make this up, right? Well, I've told you why, but most scholars don't see that. Most scholars think, okay, well, this Bathsheba story puts David in the worst possible light, therefore it must be true, and therefore it shows us David is a poet king who is constantly thinking about his own moral failings. And so he's an inspiration to his people. Okay? That's the mainstream understanding. Okay. Any other questions? Yep. That's right.
So how would they know literature?
Oh, okay. So the question is, if people at that time were mainly illiterate, why was this written down? Or how would they know the story? Okay. So the idea is this. First of all, this was written for the elite, for the people around David, to know what story to tell people. Does that make sense? Okay. This was for internal consumption. And this was to basically preserve David's historical legacy. So maybe 20 years from now, when everyone's dead, when people who knew Uriah and Bathsheba were dead, well, what is truth now? The truth is what's been written down, okay? That's why they're saying history is written by the writers. Right? History is not written by the winners. History is written by the writers. Right? Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions? Okay, great. So next class, we will continue the Hebrew Bible, okay? Because it starts off as an apology for David, but it evolves into a much larger mythology, right? So that's next class. Okay, so good morning. We are continuing the Hebrew Bible today. Last class, we talked about King David of Israel and how he created the Bible, the project of the Bible, in order to create legitimacy and authority. Okay, and we are continuing along this theme today. So let's go over the chronology of the Bible. Okay. So in the beginning, there was God. Okay, in the Bible, his name is Yahweh, and he created the world. And then he created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And people who take the Bible literally believe this was about 4,000 BC, okay? As we know, Adam and Eve, because they disobeyed God, they were banished from the Garden of Eden. And they had two sons, Cain and Abel, and then their family started to populate the earth. But then humans started to misbehave. We went to war. We were greedy. And so God decided to destroy the world in something called the Great Flood. And this is a story of Noah's Ark. Remember, Noah was beloved by God, so God told him to build a great ship, and then he will be able to live. Okay? After Noah's Ark, came along a man named Abraham, and this was about 2000 BCE. Abraham was born in the city of Ur in Mesopotamia, and he was beloved by God because he was a righteous and decent man. And God made a covenant with him. Covenant. And a covenant is a contract, it's a promise. And the contract is this: if you, Abraham, swear allegiance to me, Yahweh, I will make you and your descendants founders of a great nation called Israel that will stretch from the Nile to the Euphrates. That's a promised land. In return, as a mark of this covenant, Abraham and his ancestors will engage in circumcision. Okay? Basically, the foreskin of their penis will be surgically removed at birth. Okay? So that's the covenant. Abraham had a son named Isaac, and Isaac had a son named Jacob. Okay? Jacob is the younger son of Isaac, so Esau should have inherited the birthright and the blessing from his father Isaac. But Jacob played a trick on Esau and stole the birthright. Esau was very angry, so Jacob had to run away and live with a relative for a couple of decades. And while there, he married two sisters named Leah and Rachel. And then together, they had 12 sons. And the 12 sons became the 12 founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob will be renamed by God as Israel. So Jacob really is the founder of the nation of Israel. Jacob's youngest son is named Joseph. And he is beloved by Jacob so much that his brothers became jealous of him and sold him into slavery in Egypt. Joseph was also beloved by God, and he had a special gift of reading dreams. And he became a special advisor to the Pharaoh, and he became very wealthy. Meanwhile, back in the land of Israel, Jacob and his sons, their family, are facing this massive famine. So Joseph comes and rescues them, and the entire nation of Israel moves down to Egypt, okay, where they become very wealthy and prosperous. And because they have many children, eventually, after a couple of decades, they become a threat to the establishment. So the new Pharaoh, who has no memory of the contributions of Joseph, enslave the Israelites. And he wants them to die. So he basically forbids them to have sons. And he basically tries to sanction the Israelites as much as possible. Eventually, a man named Moses is born into the Israelites in Egypt. And because he's a boy, he has to be killed. So his mother puts him in a basket, and then this basket drifts down the Nile and into the hands of an Egyptian princess. So Moses grows up to become an Egyptian prince. But eventually, God informs him of who he really is, and he's the prophet who will deliver the Israelites back into the promised land. The Pharaoh refuses to let the Israelites go. There's a major duel between Moses and the Pharaoh. And then God sends down like 10 plagues, to force the Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Moses is taking the Israelites into the promised land. And then Pharaoh has a change of heart, and he wants to destroy the Israelites before they can escape. So the Pharaoh chases them. Moses causes the sea to part. They cross the valley, and when Pharaoh and his army are about to enter the sea closes in on them and drowns them. Okay? And then when Moses and the Israelites are in the desert, Moses ascends a mountain to receive the law of God. And this is what we call the Ten Commandments. But while Moses is away, the Israelites create an idol to celebrate Yahweh. And Yahweh hates this because Yahweh does not want to be represented on earth. So Yahweh sentences them to a long exile in the desert. And he tells Moses, you will deliver the people from Egypt, and that is your mission, but you will not enter the promised land. You can see the promised land, but you will not enter the promised land. So the mission goes to Joshua, who is Moses' disciple, and Joshua and the Israelites start a massive military campaign into the land of Canaan, which is a promised land. And over the span of years, they basically massacre the people, and they create the nation of Israel. And then we enter the period called the Judges. And these are 12 individuals who become the tribal leaders of Israel. And Israel at this time is at war with all their neighbors, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, the Canaanites. And this period lasts for a long time until the Israelites pick a king named Saul to lead them. Okay, King Saul. And then as we know from King Saul will come David, who will usurp the throne from Saul and be the great king of Israel that we remember today, okay? And David is considered the real founder of the state of Israel as well as the Jewish faith. Okay? So that's the chronology of the Bible. Now, because the Bible is written almost like a historical document, for most of human history, people believe this to be literally true. Okay? But in the past 400 years, 300 years, there are many archaeologists who have tried to prove the events in the Bible. For example, Noah's Ark. If there really was a flood, well, there will be a geological record. There will be a ship. Okay? There will be a memory of this. But there was never. But we have never been able to find any concrete evidence to support Noah's Ark. Okay? How about the Garden of Eden? Well, if the Garden of Eden really existed, well, we can also find it, and we've never been able to find it. All right? How about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Again, no evidence that any of these individuals ever existed. How about Moses? Well, we would think if Moses really did exist, there would be some records of him in the Egyptian history, right? I mean, 10 plagues is a travesty and a disaster on the Egyptian people. No record of that. The parting of the sea, no record of that. The Judges, Joshua, nothing, okay? It is only until we get to David when we begin to see historical records and proof that David actually existed. But before that, nothing in the Bible has proven to be historical. Okay, and so this is very confusing. So what I will show you today is, if you see the Bible as a historical record, you will only get confused. If you see this as a chronology, this makes no sense. If you see this as a work of fiction, like a lot of people do, this doesn't make much sense either, okay? Because when you read the Bible, these events aren't actually interconnected with each other. David has no memory of Moses, for example. That's weird. Moses has no memory of Abraham. Okay, so these stories are not interconnected. So if this is not a historical record, if this is not a work of pure fiction, what is this thing? Okay, what I will show you today is, this is not a chronology. This is a cosmology. Cosmology. Okay? Remember, last class, we talked about why things are written down in the ancient past. And as I said, kings sponsor writing projects for 3 major reasons. The first reason is to create legitimacy and authority. The second reason is to create a national identity, cohesion among the people. The third reason is the idea of differentiation. To tell people who they are not. We're Israelites, we're not Egyptians. We're not Canaanites. We're not Philistines. Okay, so these are the 3 major reasons why kings sponsor writing projects. And for the Israelites and David, these 3 imperatives are particularly salient. Okay? They're really necessary, right? So let me explain why that's the case. So, legitimacy. Remember, David usurped the throne from Saul. Saul came from a noble family, and he was elected by the chieftains to be their king. And then David launched a rebellion and eventually usurped the throne. So David has a major legitimacy problem. So how he solves the problem, as we discussed last class, is the Bible presents him as a poet king. Okay, this is a very important concept. Poet king. There have been warrior kings, right? Kings who go to war and they win legitimacy by defeating all their enemies. There have been priest kings, kings who are head of a major religion. But David is the first poet king. Okay, he writes poetry. He sings songs. He's a sensitive soul. That's what explains his affair with Bathsheba. And that tells us he could never have possibly been ambitious and want to kill Saul. Okay, he's the first poet king. So why is he king of Israel? Because guess what, guys? God is the poet God. Okay? Poet God. Yahweh is the poet God. So this is a radical conception of divinity in the ancient world. Gods previously have been priests or warriors, and this is the first time in human history where God, Yahweh, is being presented as a poet God. When you read the Bible, it's very interesting how he creates the world. He speaks and things are created. Okay? He says, let there be light. Let there be heaven and earth. He speaks. And when he speaks, a new world is created. And then he looks at this world and says, and this is good. Okay? So he's like a writer who speaks words and then who edits his words in order to create something much more beautiful. He's a poet. And as a poet, he's very sensitive. Okay? Which means he creates Adam and Eve because he's lonely. He wants friendship. Okay? So, in other words, the Bible is fundamentally a story of friendship, of two poets who are alone in the world and who found friendship and comfort in the existence in each other. Okay? And the way the Bible accomplishes is through the idea of covenant. So, in the Bible, there are 4 covenants, promises. So the first covenant is between Noah and Yahweh. It's what we call the Noahide covenant, the Noahide covenant. And the idea of this is this. After Yahweh destroys the world, he feels tremendous remorse for what he's done. And he promises Noah, as long as humans are not too evil, I will not destroy the world. Okay? If humans stay good, I will not destroy the world. The second covenant is between Abraham and Yahweh. It's called the Abrahamic covenant. And in this covenant, Yahweh says to Abraham, if you and your descendants stay true to me, I will create a great nation out of you. Okay, I will give you the nation of Israel. And the third covenant is between Moses and Yahweh. It's called the Mosaic covenant. And the idea is, if the Israelites follow the 10 Commandments and worship Yahweh, only Yahweh, then Yahweh will protect them as a nation. Yahweh will show them favor. Okay? So those are the 3 covenants. But when we get to David, called the Davidic covenant, something interesting happens. All 3 previously are what we call conditional covenants. If you do this, then I will do this. But when we get to David, it's unconditional. I, Yahweh, will promise that you, David, and your descendants will forever rule Israel. The house of David will forever rule Israel. Okay? It's an unconditional covenant that shows his everlasting friendship with David. In other words, the Davidic covenant marks the end of biblical history. Yahweh, this great God, poet God, who searched the universe for friendship, has now found his great friend in David. And so his search has ended, and biblical history has ended. Okay? So this is a radical new idea in human history, how a king and a god can be poets, and how the world, how reality can be constructed through words. Okay? And that's why in the Bible, there's a very famous phrase called, in the beginning, there was the Word. And that's why Jewish people are so literary, okay? Because that's part of their tradition. If you look at some of the most famous writers, some of the most famous thinkers in the world, they're mainly Jewish. And again, a lot of it is because the Jewish faith is the first faith to focus on literary creation. Okay? So that's the idea of legitimacy. Cohesion. There's no cohesion. Okay? The second purpose is great cohesion. And as we discussed, after the Bronze Age collapsed, the land of Canaan was in complete chaos. You had all these different groups within Canaan. You had the nomads from the desert, okay, the Bedouins. You have the hill people of Canaan. You have refugees from the cities of Canaan and these cities have been destroyed. You have Egyptian priests. You have foreign mercenaries. And now you have sea peoples, these Greeks and these other peoples who are coming into Canaan because they've lost their lands back at home. Okay? So you've got this very different group of people together. They're in competition with other groups, like the Philistines. So now they need to create a national identity out of all of this, right? And that's what the Bible is doing, guys. Okay? Remember, there's a concept we learned that's very important in class called syncretization, right? Syncretization. It means when you bring different religions together and create a new religion. So, for example, let's just say my God is Zeus, and your God is Hera. And I conquer you, and I make you part of my people, okay? So what we do in this instance is we marry our gods to each other. So now Zeus is married to Hera, and they have children like Aphrodite and Athena, okay? And this is a way to soothe the process of conquest. Because even though I've conquered you, I still have to live with you, okay? So we have to blend in our different cultures. This is also true for the idea of genealogy, family history. Every tribe has a patriarch, okay? And the reason why that patriarch is to tell the people, we've been in this land for the longest time. And that's why we have legitimacy and control over this land, because we were here first, okay? Now, when tribes get together, they intermarry, they form alliances, what they do that's very common is their ancestors merge together. And they become sons and fathers of each other. So as though it's like one family history. Okay? You take these different family histories and you merge them into one line. The same process of syncretization. Okay? So if you look at this instance, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's basically three major tribes of Israel coming together to form one family history. In this instance, the most powerful family is that of Jacob. Because Jacob, Israel, gives his name to the new nation of Israel. The second most important person or tribe is Abraham, because he's the progenitor of this family, okay? And third will be Isaac. And in fact, in the Bible, Isaac receives the least amount of attention, okay? But the synchronization process also helps us explain Moses. Because we've been looking for 100 years and we have not found any evidence that Moses ever existed or anyone like Moses existed in Egypt. Okay? So what's Moses doing? Well, what Moses is doing is explaining why there are Egyptian priests in the nation of Israel, right? And why are priests important? Because if you're David and you're now king, you want to create legitimacy and you want to create authority. And the best way you create authority is by centralizing your power. Back then, the best and easiest way to centralize power is by centralizing religious ritual. Does that make sense? So what he did was this. He made his new capital, Jerusalem, and he built something called the Temple of Jerusalem, which became the house of Yahweh. This is where Yahweh lived. So if you wanted to worship Yahweh, and you had to, because he was your God, you had to come all the way to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice. And who controlled the sacrifice process? Priests. Okay? And why did the priests, Egyptian priests, why are they controlling the sacrifice process? Because they're the ones, Moses, who led the people of Israel out of Egypt. The ones who delivered the Israelites into freedom. Moses is an Egyptian name. It means son of, okay? So it's a very common Egyptian name. So for example, Ramses means son of Ra, okay? So Ramses is a very famous Egyptian pharaoh. Ramses means son of Ra, the sun god. So both Moses and his brother Aaron, these are Egyptian names for Egyptian priests. Okay, so David was heavily reliant on these Egyptian priests in order to centralize authority. Also, the idea of circumcision, it is an ancient Egyptian practice that priests specialized in, right? So if the new law is to be a member of Israel, to be an Israelite, means you have to get circumcised, you have to circumcise your children, you're going to go to the Egyptian priest to circumcise your children because they're good at that and they know how to do that. Okay? Does that make sense? So by making circumcision the major mark of what it means to be an Israelite, it gives authority and power to these Egyptian priests. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? The judges. What we believe is the judges are these local heroes that bring in all the other tribes of Israel together. Okay? So in other words, if you are a member of this new nation of Israel, you have a deity or an ancestor within the cosmology of the Bible. Okay? And this explains why the history of Israel is so convoluted, contradictory, and complex. Because it's trying to create a national identity where everyone, all tribes, everyone is able to contribute effectively to the creation of the nation of Israel. Okay? Any questions before I continue? Is this clear to you guys? What's going on? Any other questions? All right. Now the last question is differentiation. And this is the most important, okay? Because remember, you have Egyptian priests in Israel. How do we know they're loyal to Israel and not to Egypt? Because the Egyptian priests went to war with the Pharaoh. We have Canaanites within the state of Israel. How do we know they're loyal? Because they went to war with the Canaanites, okay? So in the Bible, what's interesting if you read the Bible is the Israelites in their history went to war with everyone, okay? The Egyptians, the Philistines, the Canaanites went to war with everyone. Why? Because they had members from every single geography and location in that area. And so they need to differentiate themselves. The best way you differentiate yourself is by going to war with them. Okay, does that make sense? Oh, also guys, when I use the word nation, I have to warn you, this is not the modern sense, okay? Nation, it's a loose political affiliation that is fluid. Today, the nation state, you're Chinese, you're stuck being Chinese, okay? But back then, if you're an Israelite, guess what? You could walk across the street and become a Moabite, okay? So the idea of identity back then was extremely loose and fluid. So when we use the term Moabite or Canaanite, basically we're talking about a geographical location that has some political force. But it's not a fixed identity. Okay? The very idea of ethnicity, race, group identity, back then was extremely fluid, was basically non-existent. Okay? So Israel, the very idea of Israel, it's a literary creation. The idea of Israelite, it is a political creation. All right? Does that make sense, guys? Any questions so far before I move on? Okay? Are you clear? Yeah, no, I think good. Okay, all right. All right, so this explains why the Bible is structured the way it is. Okay? But then the question then is, and this is a very important question, is, okay, you know what? This was standard cultural practice back then. Everyone did this to create identity. So why is it we have the Bible today and not, say, other texts from Egypt or Mesopotamia? Why is it that the Bible was able to conquer the world, basically, right? Because you have 2 billion Christians, you have 1 billion Muslims. The Bible was able to conquer the world and capture the imagination of humanity. And here I want to explain why the Bible is so powerful. It was how it was written that made it so powerful. Okay? So, last class we talked about the apology of David, about the Bathsheba story, about the Abner story. And we believe the person who wrote those stories are what we call the court historian. We have absolutely no idea who he is. He's basically the official historian of the court of David, okay? And every court will have an official historian. And those stories are good, but they're not literary, okay? They're just propaganda and spin. But the person who wrote the Bible, especially Genesis, was a unique literary genius of the stature of Homer and Plato and Dante, okay? The person who wrote the Bible, who first wrote the Bible, was an incredible literary genius. And we call her the Yahwist. Okay? Why do we call her the Yahwist? It's just convention because she uses Yahweh as the name of God. And other writers don't actually use Yahweh as the name of God. Okay? So by convention, we call her the Yahwist. Now the question then is, who is she? And we're fairly certain it's a she, okay? And as I will show you, we're fairly certain it's a she because she focuses not on war, not on conflict, but on domestic tragedy and affairs, childbirth, marriage, love. And this is unique in human history. Okay? So we're fairly confident it's a she. There are many who believe she is of the court of David. And the reason why is, first of all, what she writes is very favorable to the court of David. Also, back then, as you can imagine, only aristocratic women had the privilege of reading and writing. Okay? She clearly had access to the mythology of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia. She has access to a great education. So we believe she's a princess. I will further and make the argument that she must be either the daughter or the granddaughter of King David. Okay? I would make this argument that she has to be the daughter or the granddaughter of King David. And the reason why is what she wrote, and I'll show you what she wrote. What she wrote was so controversial and so unique and so imaginative that the priesthood could not possibly accept what she did. If she was just a priest, or if she was just an aristocratic of low birth, there was no way her writings would become part of the Bible. Okay? So she must have been someone of high authority. And there is actually a precedent for this. So for example, we know that in about 2000 BCE, this is at least 1,000 years before the Yahwist began to write, the Sargon of Akkad, who is the first great empire builder, okay? The first emperor, basically. And this is someone that back then, during the time of King David, everyone knew and worshipped. Okay? King David knew about him, and he knew about his practices. When Sargon of Akkad conquered Mesopotamia, he appointed his daughter named Enheduanna to be like the high priestess of their religion. But what's interesting about her is she's a poet. And she is the first named author in human history. Okay, this is 2000 BCE. She wrote a lot of poetry. So there is a history, a precedent for these kings to appoint their daughters to be the official poet of their nation. Okay? So that's why I think the Yahwist is. But honestly, we'll never know, and it's not important. Okay? We just have to know she was an exceptional literary genius who made the Bible what it is today. All right? So let's go over some of her literary contributions very shortly. And again, because the Bible has been redacted for about 2,000 years, 3,000 years, we've lost a lot of her original writings, okay? So we'll analyze a couple of stories that we know for sure she wrote. The first is called Adam and Eve. The second is the story of Jacob and Rachel, okay? All right. So you think you know the story of Adam and Eve, but I guarantee you it's wrong, okay? I guarantee you, even if you know the story of Adam and Eve, it's wrong. All right. So let's go over the official or the mainstream understanding of the story of Adam and Eve. God told Adam and Eve, listen, this is the Garden of Eden. It's paradise. You can do whatever you want. Life is easy. Apples fall from the sky. Okay? You can pick tomatoes and carrots from the ground. Life is easy. It's paradise for you. But there's one rule and only one rule in the Garden of Eden. And the rule is, do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because it's poisonous. And of course, Adam and Eve had to disobey God. And God became so angry that he banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. And that was our act of disobedience. The first act of disobedience, our first sin, the original sin that has doomed us forever until the redemption of Jesus, right? That's a story we all know. The story is completely and utterly wrong. That's not what it says in the Bible. Okay? So I'll explain first what the Bible says, and then I'll explain how we can interpret the story. Okay, so God says to Adam and Eve, don't eat that fruit, okay? And then Adam and Eve are curious. Why can't you eat that fruit? And then Eve meets a serpent on the ground, and the serpent talk. And Eve basically says, we can't eat that fruit. And the serpent says, why? Eve says, it's poisonous. So the serpent says, no, it's not poisonous. You're being lied to. The reason why Yahweh does not want you to eat from the fruit is once you eat it, you'll become like God. Your eyes will open. You will have the knowledge of good and evil. And then Eve gets angry because she feels manipulated. And she convinces Adam to eat the fruit as well. So they eat the fruit. And their eyes are open now. They have knowledge of good and evil. Yahweh visits them in the garden, and he discovers they're hiding from him. And Yahweh commands them to come out, and he sees right away they're embarrassed about their nakedness. They're embarrassed about being confronted by Yahweh. So Yahweh knows they've eaten the fruit. Adam says to Yahweh, it's Eve's fault. Eve says to Yahweh, it's the serpent's fault. And Yahweh decides to punish all three. He says to the serpent, from now on, you will slither on the ground, and you'll be hunted by man. Eve, from now on, you and all your descendants will suffer the pains of childbirth. Childbirth will be an extremely painful process. And then he says to Adam, from now on, you must sweat to grow food, to feed yourself. From now on, life will be hardship. It will be toil and pain and suffering. Okay? And then he does this, okay? This is very interesting. And this is where the Bible demonstrates its genius, okay? And the Lord God made garments of skins for the man and his wife and clothed them. Then the Lord said, see, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now he might reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and live forever. Okay? This is where the Bible is genius. Because it's telling us why God is banishing Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. It's telling us. It's because there's another tree God didn't mention to them. It's called the tree of life. And it allows you to live forever. So why is this a problem? Well, there are two things that differentiate God from us, humans. The first thing is God has knowledge of good and evil. Second thing is God lives forever. That's it. Okay? That's the only difference. So if Adam and Eve now know good and evil, if they eat from the tree of life, they can live forever. So God's afraid we'll become like God. Therefore, to protect the tree of life, he has to banish us from the garden. Okay? Yeah?
So what would it be like without knowing good and evil?
Excuse me?
So like before Adam and Eve ate the apple, so what will like they be?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Okay. What is good and evil? Okay. So this is a really complicated idea, okay? But good and evil does not mean you know God and you know Satan. That's not what it means. It means you know what's good for you and what's bad for you. So for example, before I knew good and evil, I hit this table, okay? I feel pain, right? And I'm like, what pain? What is that? Is that good or is that bad? I don't know. So I do it again, okay? And I do it again. I cannot learn from my mistakes because I cannot differentiate what's good for me and what's bad for me. But now I know good and evil. I'm like, oh, I hit this thing. I feel pain. Therefore, it's evil. Therefore, I shouldn't do it again. Therefore, I should avoid this table. So knowing good and evil means you have the capacity to learn and to grow through a process of self-reflection. Once you have judgment, once you're able to differentiate what's good for you and what's bad for you, you can always grow as a person. Does that make sense? And if you can do this forever, the tree of life, and live forever, it means you become God because your knowledge is now infinite. Okay? Does that make sense? That's what knowledge of good and evil is. The ability to differentiate for yourself what is good for you and what is bad for you. To engage in a process of reflection and self-growth. Okay? So God's afraid that if we continue to grow, we will become as powerful as God himself. Any more questions before I continue? Okay. The key line is this. And the Lord God made garments of skins for the man and his wife and clothed them. This is right after he punishes Adam and Eve. This is right after he scolds them. Right? This is God pitying them and giving them a present. This is very strange. This is paradoxical. Why would God do this? Okay, there are different ways to interpret this, but I think this is God showing remorse and regret. Okay? This is a radical idea, but this is God saying to Adam and Eve, I'm sorry for this. This is God showing remorse and regret. Why is God showing remorse and regret? You show remorse and regret when you just think wrong, right? But what did God do wrong? What did God do wrong? Why is God in the wrong here? It's a radical idea, but can you figure it out? Okay. God lied to Adam and Eve. God said to Adam and Eve, do not eat from this tree because it's poisonous. Right? So imagine this. Imagine you're my two daughters, okay? And you're like 6 or 7 years old. And you see me at night drinking whiskey or beer. And I'm really happy because I'm drinking whiskey and beer. So you two are curious and you say to me, Dad, what is this? And I say, it's poison. And then you're like, why are you drinking poison, Dad? I'm like, well, because I'm older than you are. When you're as old as I am, you can drink this poison. Okay? You two are now curious, right? You're curious. Why is dad drinking poison? So your uncle comes to the house one day and you ask your uncle, hey, is alcohol poisonous? Your uncle's like, of course it's not poisonous. What are you talking about? And so, of course, what you two do is you break into the alcohol cabinet, right? And you drink whiskey, and you become very happy, and you throw up. I come home, and I shout at you. You guys are terrible. I told you not to drink that. Go to your room, and you're suspended for a month, okay? You go to your room, you cry. And then I come knocking and say, hey, do you guys want to go out to McDonald's and have a hamburger together? Do you understand the story? Because I know I'm not wrong. I should not have said to you, alcohol is poisonous. Okay? I'm being a bad parent. So what's remarkable about the story is it's basically a domestic comedy. You understand? This is what happens among families all the time. This is the power of the story of Adam and Eve. It's a domestic comedy. It's something we can all relate to. It's something we can all understand. What's also really powerful about the story is God is fallible. God has made a terrible mistake. What's important is this. God understands he's made a mistake. That's why he's showing remorse and regret. Okay? So again, Yahweh, he's a poet God. He's curious about the world. He wants to have friends. But he's inexperienced. He's naive. He's a new father. So he's going to make mistakes. Making mistakes is a process of growing up. What makes humans exceptional, what makes humans unique from animals is our capacity to make mistakes and to learn from them because we ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay? Do you see how radical all this is? These are radical new ideas in human history. God is fallible. What's important is to understand and admit your mistakes and grow from them. Okay? Okay. The story continues because now Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden. They have two sons named Cain and Abel. Abel is a shepherd, okay? And Cain is a farmer. They both love God. They both want the respect and the attention of God. So they give presents to God. Abel is a shepherd, so he offers mutton, okay, to God. And then Cain is a farmer, so he offers, like wheat or vegetables to God. God tastes both. And then God's like, this mutton, it's tasty, awesome, thank you, Abel. And then he eats Cain's offering, and Cain's very anxious. He's very excited. And then Cain's like, and Abel's like, sorry. And then God, Yahweh, is like, this food sucks, man. All right? And this is what it says in the Bible. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. He hated Cain's present. He loved Abel's present. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? If you do well, will you not be accepted? Okay? So again, it's a domestic comedy. You're my girls, you're my daughters. You go to school, and you work very hard on presenting a present to me. Right? And I say to one of you, oh, this is an awesome present, thank you. And I say to the other, you suck, man. Okay? I'm being a bad parent. God is being a terrible parent, okay? If you do well, will you not be accepted? You suck, man. The problem isn't me. The problem is you. You just suck. Okay? And of course, what happens next is Cain kills Abel. But then what happens next is interesting, because Yahweh finds out about this, and he banishes Cain. And then Cain says to God, hey, if you banish me, people will know I committed wrong, and therefore I will be killed by other people. Then Yahweh says to Cain, okay, I will put a mark on you, the mark of Cain. And if anyone touches you, then I will punish that person. I will protect you with the mark of Cain. Okay? And this is again, God showing remorse and regret for what he's done. Because God knows in his heart he's done wrong here. But what allowed God to understand he committed wrong is because Cain argued with him. Okay? Cain argued back. So this is a radical conception of faith in the Hebrew Bible. Faith, love of God, requires you to argue with God. Because it's only through the process of argument that God, who's fallible, will learn and grow. So when you argue, when you fight back, you're helping the other person grow. Okay? Any questions about this story before I move on? As you're going to see, it's a powerful story that reveals so much about the idea of faith and justice and divinity. Okay? Any more questions before I move on? Okay, so again, the Yahwist is a literary genius. And there are two things that make her stand out, that make her unique in the history of literature. The first is her economy. Economy just means using as few words as possible to express as much as possible. Okay? You can see the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Cain and Abel, it's very economical. She's using very few words, but within these words are a universe of ideas. Almost infinite meaning. You can interpret these stories any way you want. Okay? The second idea is irony. Irony just means she's funny. Okay? If you tell your kids, don't eat that apple, don't eat that fruit because it's poisonous, guess what? Your kids are going to eat that fruit. Okay? And then you're going to look like an idiot because it's not poisonous. So it's ironic. She's making fun of Yahweh. She's making fun of the highest authority in the Israelite faith. And again, that's why if she were not the daughter of David or granddaughter of David, there's no way this story would have gone into the Bible, okay? But it's a great story that has infinite literary power. Okay? Does that make sense? The last story I will mention is a story of Rachel and Jacob. It's a very short story. Okay? So what happens is this. Jacob runs away from his brother Esau because Jacob stole Esau's birthright and blessing. And Jacob ends up with a relative named Laban. And Laban has two daughters, Leah and Rachel. Leah is the eldest. Rachel is the younger one. And Jacob falls in love with Rachel right away. And he says to Laban, I will work for you for free for 7 years, and then I will want your daughter Rachel's hand in return for my work. And Laban says, well, you're a relative, and it's better for me to give her to you than to a complete stranger. So, yeah, okay? 7 years pass, and there's a wedding between Rachel and Jacob. That night, Jacob has sex with a woman. He wakes up and sees it's not Rachel, it's Leah. He slept with Leah. He is now married to Leah. Then Jacob says to Laban, "You've tricked me." And then Laban says, "It is the custom of our people to marry the firstborn first. We have to marry Leah off first before we can marry off Rachel. If you continue to work for me for 7 years, I will give you Rachel as well." And Jacob agrees. Okay? So it's a very short story. And there's a lot of economy and irony in the story. But again, within the short story, there's a universe of ideas and emotions. If you're able to think very clearly and closely about the story, we will discover that A, Rachel and Leah hate each other. How do we know that? Because Leah stole Jacob from Rachel. We can imagine that when Laban announced that Rachel would marry Jacob, Leah was very jealous. And for 7 years, every night at dinner, Leah would cry and scream at her father. "How could you embarrass me like this? I'm your firstborn. Do I mean nothing to you?" We can imagine the family drama and the comedy, right? Laban's like, "You know what? If after 7 years, Jacob marries Rachel, they're going to run off together, right? And for the rest of my life, I'm going to be stuck with Leah screaming at me and hitting me in the head for the rest of my life, right?" So he's like, "I need to figure out how to get out of this deal," right? So that's why he tricks Jacob. We can also figure out that Rachel and Jacob love each other. Their love is the greatest love in the world. Because, first of all, Jacob's willing to put up with this crap for another 7 years in order to be with Rachel, right? Second of all, Rachel's willing to wait for Jacob. She could at any time just run off and be with someone else, but she's willing to endure. She's willing to suffer. Okay? So we can imagine the entire family dynamic in history based on just a few sentences in the Bible. That's the power of the Yahwehs. Okay? The Yahwehs, she's really writing about what it means to be human, what it means to have a family. And that's why the Bible endures to this day. Because there are these powerful stories in the Bible that tell us, that reveal to us what it means to be human, what it means to love, what it means to forgive, what it means to have family. And that's why the Bible has inspired people for thousands of years. Okay? Because in these stories, you are part of the writing process. It's co-creation, okay? Your meaning, co-creation. Your meaning, your understanding, your interpretation is what gives life to these words. There are not many words, but your understanding of these words is what makes these words powerful to you. And again, these stories are unique in human history. The story of Adam and Eve is, everyone knows the story of Adam and Eve. Okay? Because it's just a powerful story. You can also argue the power of Adam and Eve is because it makes us nostalgic for the Ice Age, right? Remember in the Ice Age, we were in an egalitarian society where everyone was equal. And the Garden of Eden is a metaphor, a symbol for that time. Okay? So it is provoking or activating our nostalgia for that time. Within each of us must be that a long-lost memory of a time when we humans were alone in the world. There weren't that many of us. But life was fairly pleasant. Okay? Food was plentiful. We were all friends with each other. We didn't really struggle against each other. We really didn't struggle against nature. We were one with nature and with each other. Okay? Any questions?
So, who do the Christians believe to have written the Bible?
Okay, who do the Christians believe to have written the Bible? Well, God, right? These are the words of God. And so, in the Bible, there are people called prophets. Prophets. And how prophets work is they visit heaven or they're visited by an angel. And there's one scene where the angel or God takes a parchment and puts it into the mouth of the prophet. So the prophet is speaking every word that's a direct word of God. Does that make sense? Like it's almost like he's just a mailman. I'm God. I put a parchment in your mouth. You come back to earth and you basically announce the word of God. Okay? So there are people who believe God wrote every word. Okay? But this is only a minority of Christians. Most Christians believe that whoever wrote the Bible was inspired by God. That these are prophets who were inspired by God to write down the truths of God. But if you actually try to read the Bible by yourself, it's impossible. Okay? Because it's been redacted so many times. As I explained to you last class, there are at least 4 different sources in the Bible that have been spliced together randomly. And it's been edited constantly over the centuries. Okay? But honestly, no one reads the Bible in its entirety. What usually happens is people only read sections of the Bible. Most people get understanding from the Bible from preachers, okay? And preachers will explain to you what these stories mean, but you won't actually have to read them together. Does that make sense? So what I'm offering you today is not a scriptural interpretation of the Bible. I'm offering you a what we call a literary interpretation of the Bible. Okay? Any more questions? Are you guys clear about this? Okay. So we'll continue the Bible next class. And next class, we will look at the religion of Zoroastrianism. Because when the Persian Empire conquers the world, Zoroastrianism, their religion, will start to merge with the Bible, which creates new ideas, okay, that will eventually become the basis of Christianity.